This is the third Art in the Contemporary World podcast, and for this we're joined by Rebecca Dwyer, Barbara Knezevic and Vaari Claffey, and we're going to talk about two exhibitions. We're going to talk about Tonight You Can Call Me Trish at the Lab Gallery in Dublin, and we're going to talk about Wasteland by Eva Koťátková and Dominik at Project Art Centre. The first, though, will be Tonight You Can Call Me Trish. It's curated by RGKS, KSRG, who are Rachel Gilbourne and Kate Strahan. And the exhibition features work by Alan Butler, Mark Durkin, Mary Jo Gilligan, Oliver Larrick, Rachel McLean, Ailish MacDonald, Brenna Murphy, James Ojeda, and Pilvi Takal. Rebecca, if I can come to you first about the Tonight You Can Call Me Trish exhibition. Can you give us a sense of what type of an exhibition this is, and maybe what's the main kind of interest of the show?
I suppose the grouping of the artists presented here are very much tapping into this post-digital or post-internet sort of sensibility, in that there's a sense of flexibility of medium, which I suppose in itself is nothing new, but that there is this sense that there's an embrace of the vocabulary of the internet, or there's this kind of assimilation. Probably most apparent in, say, Rachel McLean's work, where you have this just effervescent video of just these really saccharine kind of colours, and the way she uses YouTube videos. It's called Over the Rainbow, and it's all just kind of hacks from, say, YouTube, and very, very high definition video, these kind of really, really bright colours of this. It's kind of like a hallucination in some ways, but the plot is kind of carried by this, by stealing clips from YouTube. Some of them are recognisable. I suppose the first.
These are mainly audio clips.
Audio clips, yeah, that she is then syncing and creating a narrative around. I think it opens with this rainbow, and everyone knows this clip. It's the stoned rainbow guy who's like, oh my god, it's a triple rainbow, it's just quite funny. And then it slips into this kind of film noir, and I think there's a perfume ad in there, and I think there's a lot of things from like Britain's Got Talent.
But all the while, this is of course, her acting in specially dreamed up scenes, that are digitally created and so on. The YouTube element is there in the background, but she's also inventing, isn't she?
Absolutely. And I suppose there's this sense that it is limitless in what she can invent, I suppose, in this, using the digital landscape as well, that there isn't any limitations, really. She can play all the parts, she can do whatever. And I suppose that's kind of the sensibility that's being tapped into with this sort of exhibition, is that, you're not actually bound to any one medium or any kind of, that there is this kind of slippery nature to it or something. And you see that, I suppose, in Oliver Larrick's video as well, in that you have all this stock footage. And I was watching Ed Wood a few weeks ago as well, and it was... he used to use all these, stock footage because he couldn't afford anything else, to try and create these, like horrific scenes of, to create a narrative. He'd use these war explosions or stills from, like, just kind of stolen from other places, and put them into these really, really low budget B movies. So there's a kind of a continuation in from that, but
these also use the world's most expensive cameras, isn't that right? They're incredibly high definition.
Which is interesting in that you have this kind of like complete banal nature of them, in that it's really, really quite boring footage, like people like liquid being poured and some flies and things like that. But yet there's, at the other side of it, there's this, like, they're nearly precious, or that they come from such a precious source. So I suppose another thing that's interesting, I think, about the work is the way that it flows. There's no real clear boundaries between the works. I mean, you do have a sense, especially with the video works, of what is what. But then you have, say, Mark Durkin and Ailish MacDonald, and
who'd provided what's called a kind of scenography for the exhibition.
Yeah.
And maybe actually that's something, Barbara, I could ask you about. As a sculptural artist yourself, these videos by Oliver Larrick and others, Rachel McLean, they sit within this scenography.
Yeah.
What could you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're just talking about sort of no clear boundaries between the works. So, I've sort of read the exhibition as sort of this situation of collapsed authorship. So, really an investigation into exhibition making itself, and these individual works are being subsumed into this tableau. They're being collectivised, actually, into some kind of meta-narrative. But the author of this meta-narrative is sort of unclear. I mean, I don't know if it's the curator. Is it the artists? But anyway, the viewer is sort of invited to view these works as not one after the other, as we do in exhibitions traditionally, but as simultaneously as like a totalising environment. So very much as an installation practice, actually, for me.
Does that at all mean that any of the individual works lose any of their impact or distinction, or does something else more potent begin to be created?
Well, I think for me, the works that sort of emerge from that relatively, or that they retain more of their sovereignty, are actually the video works as opposed to the sculptural or the spatial works, because they begin to be read as props. And in the work of, I think it's Eilish MacDonald and Mark Durkin, which is a collaborative practice anyway, these things are both sort of they manifest as display systems for the other works, but they facilitate the other artworks to a degree. And for me, that's a very interesting position for art objects to take, this sort of receding artwork, but then sort of problematically in a way, they do not read purely as display systems. They're not functional apparatus. They're actually quite aesthetic. They're reflective. They're painted surfaces. So while they support the other works, they still are aspiring to sort of a recognition of their individuality or, their distinguishability from the other things. So they're not quite prepared to give over to like this, what I'm calling collectivization at the same time. Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, Vaari, as a curator, you must have a perspective on the way in which these works are grouped and collectivized.
It's a very tricky thing, this idea of kind of over-managing what you're doing, while at the same time kind of holding on to that play, the narrative that happens in between works. And I mean, it's very, very hard not to privilege video in that situation. It's really difficult to, and I think there's been an attempt made here to undermine that to a certain extent, because suddenly lights flash and you're distracted again and your eyes pulled over to another part of the sculpture work, or suddenly what was a sculpture sort of sitting quietly in the background becomes a speaker, and then you're pulled, or you're like, I literally have to stand up and walk back over to the works again. And it's as though the works are kind of reintroducing themselves constantly if you stay with the show for a long enough time, that they're, the sculptures eventually kind of pull your attention over to them and your eye falls onto them. And I think that there really is an attempt to kind of manage this. And I kept thinking, last night I watched an episode of Girls where Hannah is trying to get Adam's attention. He's all occupied with his work and she's trying to pull his attention back in, and she's trying to pull back into some of the dynamism of their relationship at the very start, when it was peculiar and they were having odd sex and she was really drawn to him. And so she dresses up and pretends, she kind of mimics a one-night stand. I thought there was kind of this interesting idea about Tonight You Can Call Me Trish. It's different from a one-night stand, actually. It's more like a pretended one-night stand where they're actually just going, well, what if you just met me? Or this kind of idea that if you're making an artwork as a collaborator, you're pretending to be somebody else in order to be more of a certain aspect of yourself. And Barbara, you and I have talked about this before, about what collaborating means is not just your relationship with the other person, but it's rethinking a certain aspect of your work or a certain part of your relationship with yourself. And I think that does happen in the viewing of this, because there is this kind of dynamic to it. And you kind of are pulled up because this loud music comes in and you're just thinking, I could have missed this. I might have actually gone home and never heard this. And that idea of missing something, which is the work by Alan Butler, which is really not the usual kind of sound that you hear in an exhibition like that, because it's quite retro and it's kind of odd and it doesn't sound digitalised, it sounds really rock and roll, or really like a rock band.
It's a funny kind of scrunched up mixture of death metal,
Yeah.
the kind of
YouTube.
business of playing guitar and YouTube clips. So it has a kind of a sort of a digital, compacted, compressed sense to it, as well as having that sense of, the played guitars and so on.
Yeah, I mean, so just to kind of totally stretch this thing between this exhibition and the episode of Girls that I watched last night, like Adam's accusation is, he says to Hannah, well, we did that and I did that as a way of coming out of another kind of addiction. I met women, I slept with lots of women, and then we fell in love and I stopped making all those invented scenarios. And what you've done here is you've laid a narrative on top of it, a kind of wrought narrative, so this thing becomes overwrought. And that's there's always a tension between what you're doing as a curator and this possibility that you're actually slightly overdoing it. And I think that I do think that Rachel and Kate are obviously conscious of the dangers around that, and that there is a kind of choreography within the exhibition that is very self-conscious and very aware that
this seems in a way to be played out through some of the works. I'm interested in the relationship in how Rachel McLean's work, as you said, Rebecca, there's this sense of an expanded universe of possibility. All the characters in the film are played by Rachel McLean, all different versions of herself. So there's a sense of unlimited expansion of the self into all of these situations. And then Pilvi Takala's work at the entrance of the exhibition is her dressed up as Snow White, reaching the limits of where she can go as Snow White. So the sense of her need to play or perform or be transformed is specifically regulated within that context. So it seems to be an interesting take.
The thing about Pilvi Takala in this show, a lot of the time she spends a lot of energy looking at testing what's appropriate in a given situation, and what suddenly this she makes it absurd, this idea of what might be appropriate, and that's a lot of that happens within this exhibition, like what's appropriate within exhibition making, what's appropriate within authorship, and they kind of stretch that in an interesting way, I think, with the show.
Sort of really thinking around sort of notions of artistic freedom, and sort of democracy within that somehow. And whether it arrives at any of those things at all, I think it's just, as you say, Vaari, a bit of a push and pull between all of these kind of potential authors in the show.
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of there's a certain promise of technology, I suppose, and it's like considered widely, but even say the imperative to perform or something, but it's always within these boundaries, or it's never an actual free for all or complete freedom of performance. So.
I mean, indeed, again, with Rachel McLean, I suppose the ultimate, the crazy freedom of it, which, the film has a look that's somewhere between Katy Perry's California Girls video and last year in Marienbad, which you might think is an impossible combination.
I thought it was like the Holy Mountain or something.
Well,
kind of set pieces,
exactly.
Of this kind of like hallucinatory sort of
belching mountain, glitter ball mountain or something. It's very, very strange, and it does have elements of film noir. I think somebody had mentioned earlier as well.
And in all those cases, there are these personas which are explicitly sexualized in very, clear, extreme ways, and so again, the sense of the meaning of particular versions of the performed self seems to be, captured in that in a way which is, I think, kind of compelling. Which actually, I suppose, is a term of judgment, which suggests that I think it, was an interesting piece of work, which I did, though, it's I'm not really exactly sure, where it leads me. I mean, how about you, Rebecca?
I don't know whether it's if it's critical, really, of the kind of the it's certainly speaking to certain concerns of political concerns, I would think. But I'm not sure if it's wholly critical or if it's just this kind of an embrace,
I think
it's not really.
I think it is, I think it's difficult because meaning is really slippery within it, and it's hard to think about anything because it's so experiential that you're just distracted by experiencing rather than thinking. But I think there is something in it around this idea of passing that might be interesting to think about. The thing that maybe Adrian Piper does so well is this kind of idea of passing for white, or passing for a man, or and for what we might be passing for within contemporary culture. This kind of idea of holding on to other identities in order to think through our own, or in order to pull in and out of our own identities, and then I'm still always struck by this idea of the possibility that work has maybe not meaning but has consequences. So that if you have this kind of clamour, I was thinking of it as a kind of glamour within that show, because it is really, it throws everything up in the air, so you can't really pay attention, you can't really hold on to anything. And then there is the question of being left with yourself at the end of the day, which I think is an interesting one in relation to this notion of a one night stand. You are actually ultimately left with yourself. So,
how did you find at the end of it, leaving that show, Barbara? What were you left with?
I think just the sense that all of the parts became, the sum of the parts became greater than the individual parts in some ways. So, read as a whole, I was, I was excited by the possibilities in a way that what at the time I thought was sort of really investigating curatorial practice, but later on. Questioned and had cause to question whether actually who was motivating this kind of scenography, that we mentioned earlier. And I think, it's a number of questions again surrounding authorship. The sort of saccharine hysteria as well was what I was left with. Saccharine hysteria.
Yeah.
I was left
Glamour and saccharine hysteria.
Yes. So that's what I was left with. Yeah, a bit of a sugar rush or something.
Yeah.
One artist that we didn't mention there is Brennan Murphy. In my notebook, I had a few question marks lined up beside Brennan Murphy's name, which seemed, as they piled up, to begin to resemble the sculptures themselves. So there's a series of large and small little curling motifs made sculptural. Did anyone have any particular thoughts on those works? She seems in some ways to be, quite what's the word I'm looking for? I suppose an established in some ways figure within this group. But the work is, it's curious. It's more folkloric intentionally in this context.
Sort of hieroglyphs of some kind.
Yeah, kind of like or something.
That was mimicking script in some way, which I think is some of what the exhibition was doing. It was mimicking having a script or having something in mind,
or a code, maybe,
or a code or something, something decipherable. But
and in some ways, for me, maybe they were the most successful at achieving this kind of receding artwork, because in fact they did just that. In fact, they almost vanished. Which I think is really interesting. I think that's a really interesting possibility for an artwork because, actually they sort of dissolve, and at times they become mirrored in the mirrored surfaces, some of the smaller ones in particular. They really did just sort of melt into this kind of this scene of other objects, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah, which was really described by the covers over the mirrored works, that they were all kind of half obscured, and you were always confronted with the mirroring, and what they did interestingly with the mirroring was that you didn't constantly see yourself. You were much more inclined. You didn't see your legs walking by necessarily. You weren't distracted by that. It was mostly that they were actually reflecting the artworks. I don't know
that's true.
How well organised that was, but it certainly worked.
So, final word. Do you want to take a final word, Rebecca? You got the first word. I'll give you the last word too on this one.
I suppose just going back to what Barbara was talking about, the authorship. I'm interested in this kind of subdivision of roles. As well. Like I'm not sure, like where. It's kind of like bureaucracy gone mad or something in a weird way. Which is very much kind of speaks to what the exhibition is about as well. That you have this kind of micromanagement, or that. So that I think that's curious. Just that the format kind of reflects that, and it's problematic for me, but it's still interesting, I think.
Okay, so that is tonight. You can call me Trish at the Lab Gallery in Dublin that runs, or by the time this goes out, ran until 22nd of March. Okay. The second exhibition that we're going to talk about is Wasteland by Eva Koťátková and Dominik at Project Art Centre, running until the 14th of April. So let's introduce this exhibition then. Barbara, perhaps I could go to you first.
Sure. So this exhibition is the first collaboration between Eva Koťátková and Dominik, and we're presented with a scene or a collection of objects in the gallery space, along with some wall texts that are arranged in a grid sort of fashion. Initially, in my initial viewing of this exhibition, I actually didn't read the texts. In fact, I read the objects instead. For me at first it felt very much like I was stepping into a theatrical scene, staging and punctuated sort of by objects that seemed somehow to refuse the viewer, and that's because they're wrapped. So, well,
tell us about that actually, the fact that they're wrapped. What are these objects and why are they wrapped?
Right, so, there's a central kind of park-like space, divided with fencing. There's a large tree. There's this kind of curved metal kind of structure on one side leaning against the wall. There's a number of sort of curious things placed on the floor that are wrapped very, very particularly in brown paper. And of course, when I first viewed it, I was ignorant as to what this signified. On my second, subsequent viewings, I obviously read the text, and it becomes immediately obvious that these objects are, in fact, they're in service of a very particular narrative about a conversation between two unidentified parties who are negotiating the exchange or sale of a park and its subsequent shipping to another location. So this
is quite odd proposition that we have in the gallery. Bits and pieces of a park, fencing, stones, earth, all kinds of different objects of that nature, tightly wrapped in brown paper. And in the wall texts we have a back and forth dialogue which describes or sets out the negotiations around the sale of a park. Vaari, what things did you notice about this exhibition or pick up on as you came to it?
Well, I think, I agree with Barbara. I didn't at first go to the wall texts, which is kind of odd behaviour for me actually. Normally I'd make sure that I read those, but there's something that really holds you within that space, and I think it is this idea that you're somehow within a set that's about to disappear. There's somehow all of this way that they refuse you is really compelling, that they're about to go, and it really made me think about there's a work by I'm not going to remember the name now. Anyway, but her whole apartment is completely packed up and within one space, and it just feels really fragile. All of the ownership feels really fragile. Her belonging there feels really fragile, and yet all the things are really recognisable and kind of universal. So you have a bicycle, you have curbstones, you have all these things that you don't really think that you have any kind of particular attachment to them, but there is a particularity to them, and they're obviously very carefully handled within the space. So there's atmospherically, it's a very, very slow exhibition, and it's an exhibition you want to really, really spend time with. But it's very uncertain why that is, and it's hard not to think about blow up. It's hard not to think about what it means to kind of focus on particular details and to kind of let a whole load of other narratives creep in on top of you as you're looking at the works, and then they're all kind of removed and taken away. So there's quite a big sense of loss within the show. I think it's kind of the key thing that I would have felt.
Okay, Rebecca, does that idea of loss connect with you? Because it's something we can certainly come back to, but was there another impression you got from it?
Yeah, I suppose it's just this, you have these, I did go to the wall pieces first because that's what I do, but, so there is this kind of, this act of translation or so you have this exchange which is obviously virtual or, and which I suppose you buy things off the internet all the time as well, but then you have this kind of material actuality of the thing that arrives on your door. So I suppose it's kind of like that act of translation, and that there's some kind of, it's like an uncomfortable fit, and that stuff that ends up in the gallery, that I don't know, that there's some kind of remainder there, or that it just, that there's a discrepancy between that. So that's probably there's nods to kind of minimalism and things like that as well within, the concrete blocks and things like that certainly reference that. But it is just the nuts and bolts of, a park or public space as well.
Sort of orphaned objects.
Yeah. So there is definitely some kind of sense of loss, or this kind of like estrangement or something about the materials.
The story that's told partly includes within the letters the fact of one person not being able to read the other person's communication. Mm-hmm. So loss is evident in the simple fact of letters being lost.
Yeah.
Tessa Giblin, the curator of the project, has spoken about how one aspect that's important to this is the notoriously unreliable Czech postal service, and that this is something that they're aware of in setting out these letters. It's almost an in-joke to themselves in a way that you send letters and they disappear. But actually, institutionally in the Czech Republic, there's also a huge vacuum-based postal network, which, between government institutions, the post travels through these vacuum pipes instantly. So this is another thing that's in the background here. But I think loss is important on that level, certainly in terms of the actual loss of letters, but then also in the idea that someone might buy a park, an entire park and all the contents, and move it to another location. There's the difficulty around what can be moved, what can be changed, what can be maintained. Yeah. At one point there's a reference to we have to pay respect to the laws of nature here with regard to the removal of a tree.
Yes.
So the governmental laws or the regulations about the transfer of materials also have to take account of the actual things that happen with regard to the laws of nature.
It's hard not to see it as these are the kind of things that happen all the time with exhibitions, that the whole exhibition gets packed up, all of the works get packed up and taken out of one space and sent over to somewhere else. And it is very, Barbara has a book that details some of what happens to works when they're in transit. They're kind of in no man's land. Sometimes a curator or a collector can buy an entire exhibition and can just be in storage for years and years and years on end and not really anywhere, not really doing anything. And how you might unpack that and how it might become itself again.
And how it becomes retranslated every time it's restaged. It's almost like, this park is being restaged. And we're unsure in a way in the space, I was unsure in the space as to whether this was the restaging or is this the holding ground for where it's going next. There's this kind of very, very shifting sort of transient sense about all of the things that are in the space and their relationship to the viewer and to each other. It's the sense that as the viewer we're becoming sort of players to these objects. So we're in some ways activating the things that we're standing among. It also is this sort of sense of a very even without viewing the text or reading the text, I got this sense that I'd entered into this sort of sinister sort of dystopian bureaucracy of some kind, and then that's played out obviously in the wall texts, but then there's sort of the absurd within that of shipping a puddle, for example, and then I realised that of course that sound of water I can hear is said puddle dripping away in a box over there, closed box. So there's a number of disturbing kind of quite dark sort of things happening in this restaging of these objects.
Taking responsibility.
Yeah, go ahead.
About this idea about taking responsibility, Dean Hughes has a lovely little work where he takes it upon himself to go and refill a puddle every day if there's not enough water, if the level of the water is not what he thought it might be. He kind of takes it upon himself. That's interesting, this idea that there's a way that things ought to be a kind of sort of perfect being for a puddle, or a way of losing a puddle.
And I think some of these questions that are partly questions about art, the questions about the way in which this may be, storage before something is transferred or something that has arrived that's to be installed, and the care around packaging and so on, are certainly part of the work here. There's also all of these questions about institution and regulation and government and so on. But there's a nice note, I think, in the fact that that the letters that describe the back and forth exchange are signed D and E in each case. So this is the artist's first collaboration, and the letters about the exchange of a park almost seem to be about the movement of one world over to another person's world, and the anxieties around that. Did you have any thoughts, any of you, around the collaborative dimension here?
I suppose it is a kind of a sense of a kind of a translation or something, that there is something kind of that can't be reconciled or something, that there is this kind of, there's always, as you were saying with regard to the lab, that it's not enough, say, if you're collaborating with someone to be yourself, but you have to be yourself in relation, as self of yourself in relation to someone else, and vice versa. So,
and what might get lost, I suppose, in the translation of your mental puddle to somebody else's mental part.
Right. I mean, your narrative isn't going to be interpreted the same way as the person you're, potentially as you're with your collaborator. So, I think that in some ways the exhibition plays out that dynamic of the difficulty involved with collaborative practice. Both
acting yourself, in a way.
Sure, and it's being a staged version in a way of your own practice, and another version of your own practice that takes place in relation to somebody else's. So,
and do we think then, just as this is the first collaboration, and as there is perhaps this anxiety around how a collaboration might take place and what it might mean for each of these two artistic sensibilities, do we sense here that the exhibition has resulted in very rewarding collaboration, or a troubled collaboration, or
I think those things are sitting side by side. I mean, this idea that Rebecca
exactly one doesn't necessarily
brought into the other was this idea about bureaucracy, and you were saying bureaucracy gone mad, but it's to a certain extent bureaucracy as madness, as a particular kind of way of being, this kind of, it's almost a character bureaucracy within the narrative that's happening there, and there is a bureaucracy that's required in collaboration, a kind of politeness or a set of rules or an ethics or something that's always required, and they've really established some, possibly something that's possibly over clear. Maybe there's too much clarity in terms of the narrative that they're making. There's not a lot of messing around. It's all very clear, and there's this. It's all very intentional. It's all very prescribed, and so it does give you that sense that they're very pulled back from it. That there isn't this kind of anxiety of authorship that there is necessarily with the other exhibition that we saw. But it does mean that you're there free to author all kinds of things within it, which I enjoyed, I have to say, and which does. Particularly because of the setting within Project, which we've spoken about before, that it's next door to a theatre set waiting to be activated all the time, and there is that. I really distinctly got that feeling that they may come back in later and take up some of those threads and unpack some of those objects and make more. Yeah,
all of these things may yet be transported somewhere else. Yeah. We talked a moment ago about the exhibition tonight. You can call me Trish at the lab, with all of its sort of post-digital emphases. This exhibition is to some degree a more material proposition. Rebecca, what do you think about the ways in which that the actual objects sit within this exhibition?
There's certainly they're kind of props, I suppose, as well. In the same sense that that there is this sort of kind of performativity that links the two exhibitions, I think, even though one is very much material based and the other is more omnivorous, I suppose, in that respect, but there is certainly a kind of a narrative present in a lot of the works, I think.
I suppose the thing I'm trying to maybe move towards is wondering about the ways in which it has a sculptural intensity, as well as maybe, to use the word from the other exhibition, a kind of scenographic one. There's something appealing as you enter in and see the scene set up. As we begin to dwell on the individual elements within it, what then might we wish to, how might we respond to them as things within the space?
I suppose, I actually happened to be in there at a time when, I'm just after remembering this, but I came in there and there was a man, I think he was showing a few teenagers around, and I was listening to them try to explain it, as art, and he was just like, I don't have a clue. Yeah, but this is art, So I suppose, it looks like art, but it certainly has, it straddles a certain line between art and not art. It functions as a prop, and you kind of led to question whether it's been, fashioned or, or whether it is kind of to form a part of a scene as well. So I think it's what it is important to say with the references artworks, but that it still has this kind of utilitarian aspect to it.
Like, I think, the show and project, there's a sense that all of these things could be returned to the world and used productively in a sort of utilitarian fashion. Again, they're only being held here in this sort of theatrical space for a period of time. That they do retain a sense of there's original use value. They're not. There's nothing that negates that original use value, and nothing to prevent it from being, from them being continued to be used as they're intended, perhaps by a manufacturer or otherwise. So, and I just wanted to go back for a second to the we were talking about post-digital work in Tonight You Can Call Me Trish. But what's curious about that actually is that most of what we see is actually very material in that show. So it's kind of a curious. I also have the same sense about that exhibition, but it's equally as material in its outcome as the show in project. So I think that's kind of an interesting.
I suppose post-internet doesn't necessarily mean that it's not material, though.
Sure.
You have a certain look of post-internet art that is, pastel colours and, a lot of, this sort of, they have a look, and it doesn't necessarily have to be.
It doesn't have to be digital, sure.
Nina Cannell's recent exhibition near here at Camden Art Centre, I'd written a little piece for that, and one of the things she was interested in really is cables, essentially.
Sure, yeah.
The Tonight You Can Call Me Trish, she was a very kind of cable show. That of course there is all a world of clouds of digital information and so on, but there's a huge infrastructure of cables connecting all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So those two things are of considerable interest to artists. I think the way in which both of these possibilities necessarily coexist. Final word, maybe, Barbara, on project, on Eva and Dominic, and
I'm just really left with this sense of this sort of bleak, sort of theatrical proposition, I suppose, with the work and. The sense of these things being returned somehow, or being in a transitory kind of position where they're going to be moved somewhere else, and they continue to become as they go along.
Maybe final word, Vaari, on how this.
As you were talking about earlier, I kept thinking about this Philippe Perrino work, which says for 11 months of the year it's a sculpture. It's a Christmas tree. For 11 months of the year it's a sculpture, and for this 1 month it's a Christmas tree. And this idea of how artworks come in and out of being objects come in and out of being artworks, or come in and out of being part of an exhibition is kind of interesting, that dynamic, because they may just. Somebody may cycle away in them and they're no longer an artwork, and it may come back in again. So, and the person I was trying to think of earlier is Clara Legion, who's a disgrace, but I couldn't think of her name right then, but where she beats up her bicycle, absolutely smashes it into smithereens, and there's real anxiety in terms of her relationship with this object. That you can feel in that show as well. That there's, they're building relationships with these things as they're building relationships with one another, and that's what's kind of sitting in on top of them. It's going to sit on top of them over and over again as the exhibition continues to move around and tour, and that that thing will build. It does feel like it's something ripe or ripening.
Okay, well that's on until the 14th of April at Project Art Centre, and so Vaari Claffey, Barbara Knezevic and Rebecca Dwyer, thank you very much.